After my son's death, I discovered $55 million in my name and a DNA test that changed everything. The bank letter arrived on a Wednesday, sandwiched between an electric bill and a grocery store flyer. I almost threw it away without looking. In recent months, I'd been receiving nothing but collection notices and condolences from people I barely remembered. But something made me open that envelope. $55 million. I read the number 3 times, then 4, then called the phone number listed in the letter, certain this was some elaborate scam. The woman on the other end confirmed everything. Yes, the account was real. Yes, I was the sole beneficiary. Yes, the account had been opened 2 years ago by my son, Daniel Harrison. My dead son. My name is Margaret Harrison, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 58 years old, and for the past 6 months, I've been living in hell. 6 months ago, my only son died in a car accident on the highway outside Cleveland. He was just 34. I buried him in October, under the cold Ohio rain. And since then, every morning I wake up hoping it was all a nightmare. But now, holding this letter from the bank, I felt something other than grief for the first time in half a year. I felt doubt. $55 million don't appear out of nowhere. And my Danny, irresponsible as he'd been in his personal life, had always been smart with money. Even when we were living paycheck to paycheck in our small house in Akron, even when I was working double shifts at the hospital to pay for his college education, he knew how to save every cent. But where would he have gotten $55 million? And why hadn't he told me about it? I looked at the 3 children playing in the living room. Kayla, 8 years old, was helping 5-year-old Jacob assemble a puzzle. 6-year-old Olivia was drawing something with colored pencils on the floor. 3 grandchildren that Danny had left in my care. 3 children from 3 different women, each of whom had disappeared from their lives as quickly as they'd appeared. And then there was Ashley, Danny's wife, Danny's widow, and 4-year-old Noah, her son with my son, the child I'd barely seen since the funeral. That evening, after I put the children to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and tried to remember everything from the beginning. All the oddities, all the moments when something had seemed wrong, but I couldn't figure out what exactly. Danny had always been a complicated child. I raised him alone after his father, Robert, left us when the boy was only 2 years old. Robert had promised us the moon and left us with debts and a broken heart. I swore to myself that Danny would never know the poverty I'd known in childhood. I worked as a nurse at Akron General Hospital, sometimes taking extra shifts at a nursing home. There were times when I worked 16 hours a day, only coming home to make sure Danny had eaten and done his homework. Our neighbor, Mrs. Collins, watched him while I was at work. Danny grew up as a smart boy. He did well in school, was interested in computers and mathematics. In high school, he got straight A's. I was so proud of him, so sure he would become someone significant, that all my sacrifices would pay off. And they did pay off. Danny got a scholarship to Ohio State University, studied finance and information technology. After graduation, he got a job at an investment company in Cleveland. He earned good money, rented an apartment in a decent neighborhood. Finally, he had the life I'd dreamed of for him. But then the girls started. The first was Brittany, She was 19, working as a waitress at a bar, where Danny and his colleagues sometimes hung out after work. Beautiful girl with long red hair and dreams of becoming an actress. 3 months later, she was pregnant. Danny called me in a panic, telling me he didn't know what to do, that he wasn't ready to be a father or get married. I told him to be a man and take responsibility for his actions, that this child wasn't to blame for his mistakes. Brittany gave birth to Kayla in February, a beautiful girl with red curls and huge green eyes. Danny tried to be there for the first few months. He'd come on weekends, bring money for diapers and baby food. But then another girl appeared, and the visits became less frequent. By the time Kayla turned 1, Brittany brought the baby to me. Tears were streaming down her face as she explained that she couldn't manage alone. Her mother had kicked her out. She had no money for an apartment and babysitter. She couldn't find work with a small child. I told her I would take Kayla without even thinking about it, that I would take care of her. Brittany left for Colorado a week later, said she had a sister there, that she'd get a job and come back for Kayla. But she never returned. Not a call, not a letter. She just disappeared from her daughter's life as if she'd never existed. I thought this event would knock some sense into Danny, that he'd understand the seriousness of fatherhood. But I was wrong. Next came Nicole, an African-American woman, a law student, smart and ambitious. They dated for almost a year, and I started hoping this was serious. Maybe Danny would finally settle down, become a father to Kayla, create a real family. But when Nicole got pregnant, Danny panicked again. He told me he wasn't ready, that Nicole was too demanding, that he had other plans for his life. Nicole gave birth to Jacob and tried to raise him herself for the first 2 years. She was a strong woman, determined. She finished law school with a baby in her arms, passed the bar exam. But then she was offered a job at a firm in New York. Good salary, great prospects. But the schedule was insane, and she couldn't combine career and motherhood. She told me she knew she had no right to ask me this, but that I was the only person she could trust with her son. That Danny didn't want to be a father, and her family didn't understand. I took Jacob. Of course I took him. What else could I do? This boy was my grandson, my blood. I couldn't let him end up in the foster care system. Nicole called for the first few months, sent money when she could. But the calls became less frequent, then stopped completely. The last I heard, she'd married a partner at her firm and moved to Los Angeles. New life, new family. Without Jacob. By that point, I was 53, on disability retirement after a back injury I'd gotten while moving a patient. My nurse's pension barely covered rent and bills, let alone supporting 2 children. I got a part-time job at a pharmacy, working when I could, between bouts of back pain. Danny sent money irregularly, sometimes $500, sometimes $1,000. Never enough, never on time. I tried talking to him, begged him to be more responsible, to visit the children at least sometimes. He would tell me he was trying, that he was working on big projects, that soon everything would change and he promised things would get better. Then came Sarah. She was different, quiet, shy, from a good family. She worked as a librarian at the Cleveland Public Library. Danny met her at some event, and they started dating. For the first time in years, he brought a girl to meet me and the children. Kayla was 6 then, Jacob was 4. They were happy to see their dad, ran to him with shouts of joy. Sarah looked at them with warmth in her eyes. She brought them books and toys. sat on the floor, and read them stories while Danny and I talked in the kitchen. I told him she was good, that he shouldn't let her go. He said he wasn't going to, that Sarah was special, that with her he wanted to be better. They dated for 8 months. I started dreaming about a wedding, about how Sarah would become a mother to Kayla and Jacob, how we'd finally have a normal family. And then Sarah got pregnant, and this time, Danny didn't run. He proposed. They got married in a small ceremony at City Hall, just the closest people. I cried with happiness. My son was finally growing up, becoming a man. Olivia was born on a cold November morning, tiny, perfect, with Danny's gray eyes and Sarah's light hair. I held her in the maternity ward and thought that finally everything would work out. But the happiness didn't last long. Sarah struggled terribly to adapt to motherhood. She developed postpartum depression, severe and frightening. She cried for hours, couldn't sleep, was afraid she'd hurt the baby. Danny tried to help, but he didn't understand what was happening to her. He thought she was just tired, that it would pass. When Olivia was 6 months old, I found Sarah in the bathroom with a bottle of pills. She hadn't swallowed them, but she was sitting there staring at them, as if weighing her options. She whispered that she couldn't do it, that she thought she could, but she couldn't, that she wasn't made to be a mother. We put her in a clinic. She spent 2 months there, going through therapy and taking medication. When she came out, she seemed better, but she was different, distant, as if part of her had stayed in that darkness. She told Danny one evening that she needed to leave, that she couldn't be the wife he needed or the mother Olivia deserved. Danny begged her not to go, saying they would manage together, but Sarah had already made her decision. She went to her parents in Pittsburgh, left Olivia with Danny. The divorce was quiet, without drama. Sarah didn't ask for alimony, didn't demand custody. She just left and didn't look back. Danny tried to cope on his own. He hired a nanny, worked from home when he could. But Olivia was a difficult baby. Colic, bad sleep, constant crying. After 4 months, Danny brought her to me. He told me he wasn't managing, and I could see such exhaustion, such desperation in his eyes. He asked me please. So I ended up with 3 children. 7-year-old Kayla, 4-year-old Jacob, and baby Olivia. We lived in my small 2-bedroom house. The girls slept in one room, Jacob on a cot in the living room. There was never enough money. I bought clothes at thrift stores, cut the children's hair myself, cooked simple, cheap food, pasta, beans, rice. Danny came once a month, sometimes less. He brought what money he could. He promised that soon everything would change, that he was working on something big, that a breakthrough was about to happen. I asked him what breakthrough. He said investments, that he'd put money into the right things, that soon we'd all live well. I wanted to believe him, but I'd heard promises from men too many times in my life. From my father, who promised to quit drinking. From Robert, who promised to stay. From Danny, who promised to be better. And then Ashley appeared. I first saw her a 1.5 years after Sarah left. Danny brought her for Thanksgiving. She was stunning. Tall, slim, with long dark hair and flawless skin. Dressed expensively, designer jeans, cashmere sweater, a leather bag that probably cost more than I made in a month. She told me it was nice to meet me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The children looked at her with curiosity. Kayla always brave, approached first and asked if she was Daddy's girlfriend. Ashley said yes, but didn't even crouch down to be at the child's eye level. Didn't touch her, didn't try to make a connection. At dinner, Ashley barely touched her food. She sat straight, smiled at the right moments, answered questions politely, but without warmth. And when Jacob accidentally spilled juice and a few drops landed on her bag, I saw a flash of irritation in her eyes. After dinner, Danny took me to the kitchen and asked what I thought. I said carefully that she was beautiful. He told me she was more than just beautiful, that she was smart and successful, worked in a marketing firm and earned more than him. He said she made him want to be better. I asked him how she was with the children, saying that was more important than anything. He looked away and said she'd get used to it, that it just took time. But my instinct was screaming that something was wrong. I couldn't figure out what exactly. Ashley was impeccably polite, said the right things, smiled the right way. But there was a coldness in her, a distance that worried me. They dated for 6 months before Danny announced they were engaged. He told me Ashley was pregnant and they were getting married next month. I congratulated him, hugged him. But inside me, something clenched. Something about this situation felt wrong. The wedding was lavish, much more lavish than the modest ceremony with Sarah. It was held at an expensive country club outside Cleveland. I came in my best dress bought at TJ Maxx and felt out of place among Ashley's guests in their designer outfits. The children were my companions. Kayla in a bridesmaid dress that Ashley had chosen without consulting me. Jacob and Olivia sat next to me at the ceremony, quiet and a little scared by all this glitz. Ashley's family was there in full force. Her mother, Cynthia, an elegant woman with perfect nails and cold eyes, barely glanced at me. Her father, Richard, a wealthy businessman, shook my hand firmly but without warmth. They had 3 children, Ashley and her 2 brothers, both lawyers. Danny looked happy on his wedding day. He looked at Ashley as if she were the only person in the room. But when it came time for speeches, no one mentioned Kayla, Jacob, or Olivia. No one acknowledged that the groom already had 3 children. We were the inconvenient truth everyone preferred to ignore. After the wedding, Danny and Ashley moved into a large house in a Cleveland suburb, a neighborhood with good schools and white fences. I hoped that now that they had space, they'd take at least one of the children. Kayla especially asked when she could live with her dad. But Ashley said the house needed to be furnished first, that she needed to prepare for the birth of her own child, that maybe later, when everything settled down. Noah was born in March. Danny called me from the maternity ward, his voice overflowing with joy, telling me he had a son, a healthy boy, 7.5 pounds. I congratulated him and said I was so happy for him. When I came to the hospital to meet my grandson, Ashley was lying in a private room that looked more like a hotel suite. Flowers filled every surface. Danny was holding Noah, looking at him with adoration. He asked if I wanted to hold him. I took the baby in my arms. He was beautiful, with chubby cheeks and dark hair. But as I looked at him, something seemed strange. I couldn't understand what. Just, he didn't look like a Harrison. All my grandchildren had certain features: the shape of the ears, the line of the chin, the distance between the eyes. Little family markers that I'd learned to notice over years of nursing work. Noah didn't have them. I dismissed the thought. Babies change. Features emerge later. I was being paranoid, still not trusting Ashley without good reason. Over the next year, I saw Danny less and less. He stopped coming on weekends. The money came irregularly, then stopped altogether. When I called, he was busy. Noah wasn't sleeping through the night. Ashley needed his help. He had an important project at work. I would ask him about Kayla, Jacob, and Olivia, saying they missed him. He'd say he knew and that he'd come soon, that he promised, but he never came. The children started asking questions. Why didn't Daddy come? Why did Noah have a mom and dad and they didn't? Had they done something wrong? I would tell them no, that their daddy was just very busy, but that he loved them and always would. I didn't know if I believed those words myself. Then something strange happened. Danny showed up at my door one night, late, almost midnight. He looked exhausted, with shadows under his eyes and tension in his shoulders. He asked if he could come in, saying he needed to talk to me alone. We sat in the kitchen. I made tea that he didn't touch. I asked what happened. He was silent for a long time, as if choosing his words. He told me he'd done something important, but that he couldn't tell me about it now. I said he was scaring me. He told me he needed me to know that if something happened to him, I would take care of all the children, all 4 of them. I said, of course I would, but asked why he was talking like this and what was going on. He stood up, went to the window, stared into the darkness. He said he'd learned something that changed everything, that he'd taken measures, but if something went wrong, I begged him to talk to me. He turned, and there was pain in his eyes that I'd never seen before. He said he thought he was finally doing everything right, thought he was creating a real family, that he was fixing his mistakes, but that he'd been wrong about a lot, especially about Ashley. I asked if it was about Ashley. He didn't answer. He just hugged me tightly, longer than usual. He told me he loved me and thanked me for everything I'd done for him, for never giving up even when I had every reason to. I said I loved him too. He left that night, and I never saw him alive again. 3 weeks later, I got a call from the police. There had been an accident on Route 271. Danny's car had gone off the road and hit a tree. The fire had been so intense that the body could only be identified by dental records. I remember standing in the kitchen with the phone receiver in my hand, unable to breathe, unable to think. This couldn't be true. Not my Danny, not my boy. But it was true. The funeral was a week later. A cold October day with rain that wouldn't stop. Ashley sat in the front row with Noah on her lap, dressed in an elegant black suit, crying delicately into a lace handkerchief. I sat in the 3rd row with Kayla, Jacob, and Olivia. The children didn't really understand what was happening. Kayla cried quietly. Jacob held my hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. Olivia, only 4 years old, asked when Daddy would wake up. The priest spoke about Daniel Harrison, a successful financier, a loving husband and father. But he didn't mention Kayla, Jacob, or Olivia. Didn't mention the 3 families my son had created and left. After the funeral, people came up to Ashley, hugged her, told her how sorry they were. Some noticed me and the children, nodded with sympathy, but most ignored us. We were the inconvenient part of Danny's story. I tried to talk to Ashley that day to bring Noah to the other children so they could meet their half-brother. But Ashley pulled away, saying this wasn't the right time. I asked when would be the right time. She said she would let me know. But she never did. Over the following weeks, I tried to reach her. I called, left messages, once even drove to her house, but the gates were closed, the intercom silent, The children asked questions about Noah. They'd seen him at the funeral, wanted to know when they could play with their little brother. I promised them soon, not knowing if it was true. The money from Danny stopped completely. My retirement payments barely covered the bills. I got another part-time job, this time at a 24-hour convenience store, working 3 nights a week while the children slept under Mrs. Collins' supervision. The months dragged on. Winter was particularly hard. The heating in the house barely worked, and I bundled the children in every blanket we had. Kayla needed glasses, but I couldn't afford an eye exam. Jacob outgrew his shoes, and I bought him a pair, 2 sizes too big, at a thrift store, hoping he'd grow into them. Olivia often asked about Daddy. She was too young to understand death. In her head, Daddy had just gone somewhere and would come back one day. I tried to find out something about Danny's estate. I called lawyers, banks, but every time I met the same wall of silence. Everything was in Ashley's name. The house, the cars, the bank accounts. Everything went to her as the legal wife. I asked what about the other children, saying he had obligations to them. They told me that if I wanted to file a lawsuit for child support, I needed a lawyer. But I didn't have money for a lawyer. I heard gossip through acquaintances, through Facebook. Ashley had sold the big house and bought an even bigger mansion in the Shaker Heights area. She drove a new Lexus. She'd put Noah in an expensive private preschool. Once I saw her at the mall. She was walking with friends, laughing, with shiny bags from boutiques. Noah was sitting in an expensive stroller, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than I spent on all 3 children in a month. I approached her, my heart pounding. When she turned around, irritation flashed across her face. She seemed surprised to see me. I asked how Noah was, saying the children asked about him all the time. She said he was fine and that they were very busy. I suggested we could arrange a meeting, that it would be good for the children to know their brother. She smiled tightly and said she didn't think it was a good idea, that Noah was still too young to understand complicated family dynamics. I told her they were only a few years old and just wanted to play together. She said I had to understand that she was building a future for her son and couldn't allow complications from Daniel's past to affect it. I asked if she meant complications, saying these were his children, her stepchildren. She said they were children he hadn't properly cared for during his life, and that she wasn't obligated to fix his mistakes. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the mall, trembling with rage and powerlessness. That night, I cried for the first time since the funeral. Not quietly, but sobbed, covering my face with a pillow so the children wouldn't hear. How could my son have married such a woman? How could he have let her treat his children like problems to be ignored? But then I remembered that last visit, 3 weeks before his death. His words about learning something that changed everything. What had he learned? And was it connected to his death? I started asking questions, carefully, without attracting attention. I called Danny's colleagues, his friends, anyone who might know something about his last weeks. Most were evasive. They offered condolences, but told me nothing. But one person, Marcus, who had worked with Danny at the investment company, agreed to meet with me. We sat in a coffee shop near his office. Marcus was nervous, constantly looking around as if afraid someone was listening. He told me he wasn't sure he should be telling me this, but that Danny had been doing strange things in recent months, transferring large sums of money to offshore accounts, requesting confidential banking records. He'd even hired a private detective. I asked why he would hire a detective. Marcus leaned closer and said he suspected something about Ashley, that he'd heard Danny talking on the phone with someone about a paternity test, saying that everything had been a lie. A paternity test? My mind spun. Did Danny suspect that Noah wasn't his son? Marcus said he didn't know anything else, but that a week before the accident, Daniel had looked terrible. Wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating. He'd told Marcus he'd taken measures in case something happened to him. I asked what measures. Marcus said Danny hadn't specified, just said he'd taken care of his family, his real family. After that meeting, I couldn't get Marcus's words out of my head. If Danny suspected Noah wasn't his son, it explained a lot. His desperation during that last visit, his words about learning something that changed everything. But how could I verify this? I had no access to Noah, no money for a lawyer or private detective. I tried to contact the detective Marcus had mentioned. I called all the agencies in Cleveland, asking if Daniel Harrison had worked with them. Most refused to answer, citing confidentiality. But one detective, an elderly man named Frank Miller, finally called me back. He told me he'd worked with my son and that he was sorry for my loss. I asked what he could tell me. He was silent for a moment, then said that while he was bound by confidentiality, given the circumstances, he would say this much. My son had commissioned an investigation of his wife, specifically her past relationships and the origin of her child. The results had been significant. I asked what he discovered. He said my daughter-in-law had had a long affair with a man named Tyler Kennedy. They'd been together for 3 years before she met my son. According to his data, they'd never completely ended the relationship. I asked if she was cheating on Danny. He said it looked that way, and there was something else. The timing of the pregnancy raised questions. My son had wanted to conduct a DNA test, but he needed a sample from the child. He'd been working on how to get it discreetly. I asked if he knew whether Danny had gotten that sample. The detective said the last time they'd spoken was 2 days before his death. Danny had said he'd received the results and was going to confront Ashley. He'd been furious, but also determined. He'd said he wouldn't let her get away with it. And then he died. The detective agreed and added that between them, the circumstances of that accident didn't sit right with him. My son had been a careful driver. He knew that road well, and the car had caught fire too quickly, too intensely for an ordinary car accident. I asked if he thought someone had. He said he didn't officially think anything, but if I were to ask him to speculate, he'd say my son had discovered a truth that cost someone a lot, and that someone didn't want the truth to come out. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. Had Ashley and her lover killed Danny? It seemed incredible, like a movie plot. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. If Noah was Tyler's son and not Danny's, then Ashley had married for money. She'd used the pregnancy to trap my son, to get access to his money. And when he discovered the truth, she eliminated him. But how could I prove it? I went to the police. The detective handling the accident case listened to me patiently, took notes. But when I finished, he shook his head. He said he understood I was looking for answers, but without concrete evidence, they couldn't open a murder investigation. The accident had been thoroughly examined. There were no signs of tampering with the vehicle. No witnesses indicating outside involvement. I mentioned what the private detective had said, but the officer said that private detectives often see conspiracies where there are none, that it wasn't official evidence. I asked what if I got a DNA test, proved that Noah wasn't Danny's son. He said that would prove infidelity, but not murder. He was sorry, but his hands were tied. I left the police station in despair. The system wasn't going to help me. I was alone in this fight. But I couldn't let it go. Not when there was a chance my son had been murdered. Not when his killer was raising someone else's child on his money while his real children starved. I started following Ashley. I know how that sounds, but I was careful. I park at a distance from her house, watch through binoculars I'd bought secondhand. I recorded her movements, who she met with, where she went. After 2 weeks of surveillance, I saw him. A tall man with dark hair came out of Ashley's house early one morning. He leaned down and kissed her, not a friendly kiss, but a long, passionate one. Then he got into a BMW and drove away. I photographed him on my phone. A reverse license plate search led me to a name, Tyler Kennedy, Ashley's lover, Noah's father, possibly my son's killer. Over the following weeks, I continued to watch. Tyler regularly visited Ashley, sometimes staying overnight. Sometimes I saw him playing with Noah in the yard, and the resemblance was obvious. They had the same face shape, the same eye color, the same gait. How had I not noticed this before? But I'd only seen Noah once at the funeral, and I hadn't been looking for signs of paternity then. I needed a DNA sample from Noah. But how to get it? I couldn't just walk up and ask for a lock of hair. I waited for my opportunity. And it came in November, almost a year after Danny's death. Ashley and Tyler threw a birthday party for Noah at a local entertainment park. I learned about it through Facebook. Ashley had posted an invitation. The event was open to children from Noah's preschool. I took Kayla, Jacob, and Olivia. I dressed them in the best clothes we had. I told them we were going to their brother's party. When we arrived, Ashley was shocked to see us. She asked what I was doing there. I told her it was Noah's birthday and of course we'd come, that the children wanted to see their brother. Her face reddened with anger. She said we weren't invited. I replied that it was a public park and they were his siblings. She clearly wanted to throw us out, but there were other parents around watching the scene. She couldn't make a scene without looking bad. She told us through clenched teeth that we could stay if we wanted, but not to cause trouble. The children ran to play with the other kids. Noah was the center of attention, wearing a crown and with a dinosaur-shaped cake. Kayla approached him shyly. She introduced herself as his sister and asked if he remembered her. The 4-year-old boy looked at her with curiosity, then nodded. She asked if he wanted to play with her. My heart melted, watching my grandchildren get to know each other. Kayla was so gentle with Noah, showing him how the arcade games worked, sharing her tokens. While the children were busy, I watched Ashley and Tyler. They acted like a couple, his hand on the small of her back, whispers in her ear, intimate smiles. Anyone could see they were more than just friends. But I needed more than observations. I needed evidence. My opportunity came when Noah spilled juice on his shirt. Ashley took him to the bathroom to change, leaving the bag with his things on the table. I waited for a moment when no one was looking, quickly took a brush from the bag, wrapped it in a napkin, and hid it in my pocket. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was afraid everyone could hear it. But no one noticed anything. We left shortly after. The children were upset. They wanted to stay longer, play with Noah. But I couldn't risk Ashley discovering the missing brush. The next day, I sent the brush to a DNA testing lab, along with a sample of my saliva. The company specialized in establishing relationships between grandmothers and grandchildren. Results were promised in 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were torture. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I constantly checked the mail, waiting for the envelope with the results. When it finally came, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely open it. The result was unequivocal. The probability of a biological relationship between me and Noah was 0%. Noah was not my grandson, not Danny's son. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at those numbers, feeling rage boiling inside me. Ashley had lied. She'd married my son under false pretenses, inherited all his property based on a child who wasn't even his. And Danny had known. That's why he'd been so upset during that last visit. That's why he talked about learning something that changed everything. And then he died. I went back to the police with the test results. This time, the detective was more interested. He admitted this changed things. If Mrs. Harrison had fraudulently obtained the inheritance, it was fraud. And if my son had discovered the deception and confronted her, that was a motive for murder. He said they'd open an investigation, but warned me it wouldn't be easy. Almost a year had passed. The evidence was cold, and Mrs. Harrison had expensive lawyers. I didn't care how difficult it would be. I wanted justice for Danny. But then something strange happened. Literally a week after the police started the investigation, I received that letter from the bank. The letter about $55 million in a trust account in my name. When I called the number, the bank employee explained the details. The account had been opened 2 years ago by Mr. Daniel Harrison. The funds were locked in a trust with instructions that they couldn't be accessed for 1 full year after his death. I asked why a year. According to the note he'd left, if he was really dead, I would need time to grieve and decide what to do with the money. But if he'd just disappeared, it would give him time to come back and explain everything. I asked what that meant about just disappearing. The employee apologized and said that was all that was recorded. I asked when I could access the funds. 2 weeks, she told me. They would send me the necessary documents. I hung up the phone, my head spinning. $55 million. Danny had hidden $55 million from Ashley. He'd known about her deception and taken measures to ensure his real family was provided for. But something about the wording bothered me. The part about if he just disappeared, giving him time to return. Why would Danny write that? Had he been afraid he might have to fake his death? I tried to dismiss the thought. My son was dead. I'd seen the burned car, attended the funeral. The dental records confirmed the body was his. But something kept gnawing at me. I called Detective Miller, the private investigator who'd worked with Danny, and asked when he'd last spoken with my son. 2 days before the accident, he told me. Then he asked why. I asked if Danny had said anything unusual, anything that seemed strange. Miller was silent for a moment, then said that now that I mentioned it, Danny had asked him about how a person could disappear, how to create a new identity. He'd thought Danny was just curious, but then after the accident, he'd wondered. I asked if he thought Danny could have faked his death. Miller said he'd thought about it, but the body had been identified. The dental records had matched. I asked how reliable dental records were. He said they were quite reliable. But if someone really wanted to deceive the system and had time to prepare and enough money, then he trailed off, but the implication hung in the air. I spent the next few days in feverish research. I read about cases of faked deaths, about how people did it, what was required. Most cases failed due to lack of planning or resources. But Danny had both: $55 million and 2 years of planning. What if he was alive? The thought was both incredible and intoxicating. But how could I find out? I couldn't just start calling mortuaries asking if they'd really identified my son. And then I remembered something. Danny had a scar on his left shoulder from surgery after a football injury in high school. A specific scar that should have been visible, even on a burned body. I called the coroner's office and identified myself as Daniel Harrison's mother. I said I had a question about the body. The woman on the other end was sympathetic but cautious. She asked what I wanted to know. I told her my son had had a surgical scar on his left shoulder and asked if it had been noted in the autopsy report. She put me on hold for what felt like an eternity. When she returned, her voice was careful. She said that according to the report, the body had been severely burned. Identification had been made solely based on dental records. There was no mention of any scars because the tissue damage had been too extensive. I asked if that meant she couldn't confirm the scar was present. She said no, she was sorry. I hung up, my heart racing. They hadn't checked for the scar. The identification was based only on teeth. But could Danny have been smart enough and rich enough to fake dental records? Or to find a body that could be passed off as his? The thought was horrifying, but the more I thought about it, the more possible it seemed. If Danny had faked his death, where was he now? Why hadn't he contacted me? Did he know I was struggling, raising his children in poverty? 2 weeks later, I received the documents from the bank. The trust fund had matured. $55 million were mine. Along with the documents came a letter, a sealed envelope with my name written in Danny's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter explained everything. Ashley had deceived him. Noah wasn't his son. She'd planned it from the beginning, getting pregnant by her boyfriend Tyler, passing the child off as Danny's, marrying him, getting access to his money. When Danny discovered the truth, he confronted her. She didn't deny it. She and Tyler had been planning to kill him. He'd overheard their conversation discussing how to make it look like an accident. He'd had 2 choices: go to the police and hope they'd believe him without evidence, or disappear. Let them think he was dead, while he gathered proof to destroy them. He'd chosen the second option. That night on the road, he'd staged the accident. He'd used a body from the morgue. He told me not to ask how, that he'd paid a lot of money to the right people. He'd made sure the fire was intense enough that identification would only be by teeth. He'd forged the dental records beforehand. He acknowledged that he knew he'd caused me pain, that I'd grieved for him, that it was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Every day, he'd wanted to come back, to hug me and the children, to tell us he was there. But if Ashley and Tyler had known he was alive, they would have tried again. And next time they might have hurt me or the children, he'd needed a year to collect evidence. Recordings of their conversations, money trails, proof of their plans. Now he had everything. The attached flash drive contained everything the police needed to arrest them. He told me to give it to the detective, that they wouldn't be able to escape this. The money was for me and the children. All 4 of them. Yes, even Noah. It wasn't the child's fault. his mother was a monster. He asked me to take care of Noah if I could, that he was an innocent child in this mess. He apologized for everything, for being a bad son, for leaving me to raise his children, for making me think he was dead. But soon it would all be over. Ashley and Tyler would go to prison, and he could come home. He said he'd see me soon, and that he loved me always. It was signed Danny. I sank into a chair, the letter trembling in my hands. Danny was alive. My son was alive. Tears streamed down my face, tears of relief, anger, joy, confusion. A year, a whole year I'd grieved for a dead son. The children cried for their father, and all that time he'd been alive, hiding somewhere, collecting evidence. I found the flash drive in the envelope. I plugged it into the old laptop that Kayla used for schoolwork. What I saw made my blood run cold. Hours of recordings. Ashley and Tyler discussing how to kill Danny, how to stage an accident, how to get the insurance money. Videos of them together, long before Ashley supposedly met Danny. Bank records showing how they'd transferred Danny's money to offshore accounts. And the most shocking thing, medical records proving that Ashley had gotten pregnant 2 months before she met Danny. Everything had been set up from the beginning. The next morning, I went to the police with the flash drive. The detective who was handling the investigation sat with me in a small interrogation room and watched the recordings. His face grew increasingly grim with each passing minute. He asked where I'd gotten this. I told him from my son that he'd left it for me. I didn't specify that he was alive. I wasn't sure if I should. Danny's letter hadn't said exactly when he planned to return. The detective said this was enough for an arrest warrant. More than enough. Within 48 hours, Ashley and Tyler were arrested. The charges included fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted murder. I watched the news that night, seeing Ashley being led out of her mansion in handcuffs. Her face was twisted with rage and fear. Tyler looked defeated, head down, shoulders slumped, but my son still didn't show himself. Where was he? The letter had said soon, but what did soon mean? Weeks passed. The trial was set. Ashley's lawyers tried to get her released on bail, but the judge refused, deeming them a danger to society. I used some of the money from the trust fund to move to a better house. Not a mansion like Ashley's, but a nice house with 4 bedrooms in a decent neighborhood. Each child had their own room, a yard with swings, new clothes, proper food. Kayla got her glasses. Jacob got shoes that fit. Olivia went to a preschool where the teacher said she was gifted. But I couldn't fully enjoy it. Not when Danny was out there somewhere, still hiding. I didn't tell the children. How could I? How could I explain that their father had faked his death? That the whole year they'd been grieving, he'd been alive? Then something strange happened. 3 months after Ashley's arrest, social services contacted me. They told me they needed to talk about Noah. Since his biological father was arrested and his mother was in jail, he needed a guardian. I thought about it. Noah was an innocent child in all this mess. It wasn't his fault his mother was a fraud and potential murderer. I told them I would take him. He was my grandchildren's brother. He belonged with family. When I brought Noah home, he was scared and confused. A 4-year-old child didn't understand why his mommy and Tyler had been taken away. Kayla, Jacob, and Olivia were cautious with him at first. But children are amazingly resilient. Soon they were playing together, sharing toys. watching cartoons on the couch. One night, 4 months after Ashley's arrest, when I was putting the children to bed, there was a knock at the door. I opened it, and there stood Danny. He looked different, thinner, with a beard and longer hair, a scar on his forehead that hadn't been there before. But the eyes, his eyes were the same. He said hello quietly. I don't remember moving. I was just suddenly hugging him, sobbing into his shoulder, holding on so tight as if he might disappear again. I told him he was really here. He said he was, that he was so sorry for everything. We sat at the kitchen table until 3 a.m. He told me everything. How he'd discovered Ashley's deception. How he'd overheard their plans to kill him. How he'd prepared his faked death, including finding a body at the morgue through illegal channels that cost him a fortune. He said he'd spent a year collecting evidence, living in a cabin in Pennsylvania under a fake name. Every day he'd wanted to come back, but knew he had to be sure they had no way to get away with it. I asked why now? Why not earlier? He said because now they were behind bars. They couldn't hurt me or the children. The lawyers said the plea deal was almost done. Ashley would get 25 years, Tyler 30. I asked what about him, that he was technically dead, and how. He smiled tiredly and said he had good lawyers, very good ones. They were working on the legal side of his resurrection. It was complicated but solvable, especially given the circumstances. I told him the children would be so happy, that Kayla prayed for him every night, that Jacob kept his photo under his pillow, that Olivia still asked when Daddy was coming back. His eyes filled with tears. He asked if he could see them. I said they were sleeping, but tomorrow morning would be fine. That night, Danny slept on the couch. I couldn't sleep, kept checking that he was really there, that this wasn't a dream. The next morning, the children woke up and came downstairs for breakfast. Danny was waiting for them in the living room. For a second, they just stood there, stunned. Then Kayla screamed his name. All 3 rushed to him. He fell to his knees and hugged them all at once, crying into their hair, telling them over and over how much he loved them, how much he'd missed them. Kayla sobbed that they'd thought he was dead. He said he knew and that he was so sorry. Jacob asked why he'd left. Danny explained that bad people had wanted to hurt Daddy, that he'd had to hide to protect them. Olivia whispered, asking if he would stay now. He promised forever. Then Noah appeared, curious about the noise. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the stranger hugging his siblings. Danny looked at him, and I saw conflict in his eyes. This child was a symbol of Ashley's betrayal. But he was also an innocent 4-year-old boy who'd lost everything. Danny said hello gently, introducing himself as Kayla, Jacob, and Olivia's dad. Noah asked in a small voice where his mommy was. Danny told him his mommy couldn't be there right now, but that he was safe here with them. Danny extended his hand. After a minute of hesitation, Noah took it. The following months were a period of healing and adjustment. Danny went through the legal nightmare of resurrection. There were investigations, hearings, endless paperwork. But ultimately, given the circumstances and the fact that he'd helped put 2 criminals behind bars, the authorities were lenient. The trial of Ashley and Tyler was a sensation. The recordings Danny had collected were played in court. Their cold discussion of how to kill my son, how to stage the accident, how to split the money after his death. Ashley tried to claim she'd been coerced, that Tyler was the mastermind, but the recordings clearly showed she was an equal partner in the conspiracy, perhaps even the instigator, It took the jury only 4 hours to reach a verdict: guilty on all counts. Ashley got 25 years for fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. Tyler got 30 for attempted murder, since he was supposed to plant the device in Danny's car, though Danny had staged the accident before Tyler could do it. I sat in the courtroom when the sentence was read, watched Ashley cry, beg for mercy, but I had no sympathy. This woman had tried to kill my son, stolen his money, abandoned his children. Justice was served. After the trial, the real work began, rebuilding our family. Danny moved into the new house with us. He started therapy to deal with the trauma of his experience and the guilt over making us grieve. The children went to therapy too. Kayla especially struggled with anger at her father for leaving. But over time and with the help of professionals, she began to understand why he'd done what he'd done. Noah was the most complicated case. He'd lost the only parents he'd known. Even if they were criminals, they were his family. Danny showed incredible patience with him, never forcing a connection, just being there. Constant, kind, reliable. Slowly, over time, Noah started calling Danny Papa Dan. A small acknowledgement, but it meant everything. Danny used part of the $55 million to create trust funds for all 4 children. Education, first home, starting a business, everything provided. The rest he invested wisely, lived modestly despite the wealth. We didn't move to a mansion like Ashley's. We stayed in our cozy 4-bedroom house. Danny said he never wanted that lifestyle again. Money was security, not status. He started working from home, consulting for companies on financial strategy. The flexible schedule allowed him to be present at all school events, all soccer games, all art shows. He became the father he should have always been. 5 years have passed since Danny came back from the dead. Kayla is now 13, a brilliant student with plans to become a doctor. Jacob is 11, playing basketball and dreaming of the professional league. Olivia is 9, and her drawings decorate every wall in the house. And Noah, now 9, is a full member of the family. He calls Danny Dad without hesitation. Does he remember Ashley and Tyler? Sometimes, but the memories are fading, replaced by new ones. Happy memories of family trips, birthdays, ordinary evenings around the dinner table. I'm 63 now, officially retired, though I sometimes volunteer at the local clinic. Most of my time is spent with my grandchildren, enjoying simple pleasures I couldn't even dream of 5 years ago. Every Sunday we gather for family dinner. Danny cooks. He learned surprisingly well during his year in isolation. Children help set the table, argue about who sits where, laugh at inside jokes, and every Sunday before eating, we hold hands and give thanks. Not a prayer exactly. We're not a particularly religious family, just a moment of acknowledging how lucky we are, how easily it all could have gone differently. Sometimes I think about Ashley sitting in prison. I wonder if she regrets it, if she understands what she threw away, not the money, but the chance to be part of a real family. But mostly, I don't think about her at all. She made her choices and now lives with the consequences. Our story could have ended in tragedy. My son could have really died on that road. Ashley and Tyler could have gotten away with murder. The children could have grown up thinking their father had abandoned them. But instead, we're here, all together, whole, healing. Recently, Kayla asked me if I'd forgiven Danny for making us think he was dead. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I told her he did what he thought he needed to do to protect us. Did it cause pain? Yes, but he also gave us a future. So yes, I forgave him. I would have done the same if I thought it was the only way to keep my family safe. Kayla thought about that, then nodded. She said she forgave him too, even if she was still angry sometimes. I told her it was okay to be angry, that love and anger could exist together. That's a lesson I've learned over these years. Family is imperfect. We make mistakes, hurt each other, sometimes in terrible ways. But if there's love at the foundation, real, unconditional love, you can survive almost anything. My son was far from perfect. He left 3 children with different women. He married a con artist who tried to kill him. He faked his death and made us grieve for a year. But he also made sure we were provided for. Spent a year in isolation collecting evidence to protect us. Came back and became the father he should have always been. I still have a nurse's instinct, seeing the good and bad in people, understanding that we're all complex, capable of both great kindness and terrible mistakes. But I also know this: when everything comes down to it, when all the layers are stripped away, what remains is family. Not the perfect family from TV shows, not the glossy family from magazines. Real family, with scars and stories, mistakes and forgiveness. Our family survived through stubbornness, love, and tremendous luck. The 55 million helped, of course, but money doesn't create family. People do. People who show up, who stay even when it's hard, who forgive even when it hurts, who believe tomorrow can be better than today. Now, sitting in our living room on a Sunday evening, watching Danny help Jacob with math, while Kayla teaches Noah and Olivia to play cards, I know we're rich in ways that have nothing to do with a bank account. My son came back from the dead. My grandchildren smile and laugh. Our house is filled with warmth. That's real wealth. That's what Ashley never understood and never had. And the 55 million, it just gives us the freedom to create memories without worrying about bills. Security that lets us focus on what really matters: each other.